I have said time and again during my homilies that the resurrection cannot be described only as a moment of personal vindication for Jesus, but really it has an impact on us as the church. And we see in this gospel text here for the second Sunday of Easter, also called Mercy Sunday, an opportunity to focus on what the Lord really is asking of us as church, especially as he appears to these disciples. He comes back from the dead, not just for himself, but for them. And that's all the more in view as he comes back a second time, because Thomas wasn't there the first time. He wants to make sure that everyone is included. And so that helps us understand that, first of all, we as a church, if we're going to carry on this work of Jesus in the world, have to understand that we have to do it together, that no one can be excluded, that unity is the first mark of the church. We live in a society today of great polarization, where people seem not only to be separated in terms of their ideas, but personally separated, to the point that studies show that we see today, if people in a family belong to different political parties, they don't gather for Thanksgiving anymore. They can't talk to one another. That's not the Christian way of doing things. It doesn't mean that we can't have different ideas, but we should never allow those ideas to separate us one from another. Unity is the first mark, or the hallmark of the church. And so we should reject anything that in some way divides us, especially through social media or media outlets today that want to tear us apart. We should reject all of that. The second thing that we see is that Jesus shares with the disciples his wounds. It is an understanding of the church as always keeping in focus that we are to go to the cross with the Lord. And that's what we do every time we come to the Eucharist. Jesus brings us back to the cross and asks us not only to share in the work of reaching out to those who are suffering in the world, but to value our sacrifices as we come to the Eucharist and join our own sacrifices and sufferings with the Lord for the salvation of the world. You know, there's that prayer that we say, "May the Lord accept the sacrifice at our hands to the praise and glory of his name." When I invite people to share not only in the sacrifice that is of the priest and Jesus, but their own. That's what the Mass does. It brings us to the cross once again to realize that our sufferings do matter. And finally, we see that the disciples are called to belief. Not only that Jesus rose from the dead, but to have a firm belief that we are given a share in the work of Christ as partners in bringing about the salvation of the world. That is a sharp incline for us to overcome, to really value our lives as important for God's salvation of the world through Christ, to realize that we have a part in bringing about the salvation of the world. That's sometimes much more difficult to believe than that Jesus rose from the dead, because it entails believing in ourselves, valuing our life, loving the life that God has given us, to the point that we see how God looks upon us as partners. That's why Jesus breathes the Spirit upon them and gives them that important task. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven. Whose sins you retain are retained. If we do not forgive one another and bring about healing in the world, then that sore wound that Jesus tries to overcome on the cross will continue to suffer. So today, Jesus reminds us he comes back from the dead for us, to unite us as one, to share in his sufferings, but also to share in his work of bringing about the salvation of the world. That's the true meaning of the resurrection. Not just Jesus' personal triumph, but the triumph that includes us in bringing us to a whole new understanding of our life. In fact, bringing us to new life.